The sky over Europe once belonged to the Luftwaffe. In 1940, German pilots looked down from their cockpits with absolute confidence. They ruled the air, sleek, disciplined, and deadly. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s cut through the clouds with ease, symbols of a war machine that seemed invincible. To them, no foreign plane could ever challenge their mastery. And when they first heard whispers of a new American fighter, something called the P-51 Mustang, they laughed. In the early years of the Second World War, the air war over Europe was a German domain. The Luftwaffe's pilots were the elite of their time, veterans of Spain, Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. They had fought and survived the fiercest skies in history. Their aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and tested in combat, and their confidence was not arrogance. It was experience. To the Allies, that sky was a graveyard. British bombers flew night after night, losing hundreds of crews. American bombers, when they finally joined the war, flew by day and paid the price. By 1942, the U.S. 8th Air Force began its campaign of daylight bombing over occupied Europe. The idea was bold: precision bombing under clear skies, striking factories, railways, and fuel depots. But daylight meant visibility, and visibility meant death. At first, American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator went without long-range escort. The plan had seemed reasonable on paper. Each bomber carried machine guns in every direction. They flew in tight formations, boxes of defensive firepower. American commanders believed that the bomber will always get through. They were wrong. Over the heart of Germany, the Luftwaffe waited. Squadrons of Bf-19s and Fw-19s rose to meet the bombers with ruthless precision. They dove through formation walls of fire, cannons blazing, tearing through aluminum and men. In the autumn of 1943, the numbers told the story. On missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg, 1 in 5 bombers never came back. The skies above Germany became killing fields. Crews were being slaughtered faster than they could be trained. The Germans watched all this with grim satisfaction. They had seen every Allied fighter tried against them: the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and none could follow the bombers all the way to the target and back. The Allies could fight at the edges, near the Channel, near home, but not deep inside Germany. That distance was the Luftwaffe's shield. In the officers' messes of occupied France, German pilots joked that the Americans were brave, but foolish. "They build fine bombers," one ace said, "but their fighters are too heavy for our sky." What they didn't know was that, in factories across the Atlantic, something new was taking shape. A machine that would soon make those words a bitter memory. The P-51 Mustang did not begin as an American legend. In fact, it began as a British request. In 1940, with war raging and Britain standing alone, the Royal Air Force approached the North American Aviation Company in the United States with a desperate need: a new fighter, fast. The company had never built a fighter before, but they promised one in 120 days. And they delivered. The prototype, designated the NA-73X, took to the skies in October 1940. It was sleek, modern, and fast, faster than expected. But its engine, the Allison V-1710, was its weakness. Below 15,000 feet, the aircraft performed beautifully. Above that, it lost power. And over Europe, the war was being fought above 20,000. To the RAF, it was interesting, but limited. The Mustang was assigned to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack duties. Useful, but not revolutionary. Then came the change that would alter the course of the air war. A British engineer, Ronald Harker of Rolls-Royce, saw potential in the Mustang's frame. "The best airframe we've seen," he wrote, "if only it had a better engine." That engine would be the Rolls-Royce Merlin. It was the same power plant that gave the Spitfire its bite, a supercharged high-altitude marvel of engineering. When American and British engineers fitted the Merlin into the Mustang's streamlined fuselage, the result was explosive. The P-51B was born. Now the Mustang could climb higher, fly faster, and, most importantly, fly farther. Its range exceeded anything the Luftwaffe had faced. With external fuel tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way from England to Berlin and back. In 1943, the first squadrons began to arrive in Europe. They were sleek, silver ghosts among the clouds. German pilots noticed them immediately. At first, they assumed it was another P-40 or a new version of the Thunderbolt. They didn't yet realize what had changed. That realization would come soon enough, and it would come in fire. The first Mustangs entered combat quietly. Pilots loved them immediately. They were agile, balanced, and responsive at high speeds. They could dive faster than a Bf-109 and outturn an FW-190 at altitude. And with the Merlin engine, they could fight at 30,000 feet, where German bombers and fighters once ruled uncontested. But the true test would come in the winter of 1943, when the daylight bombing campaign resumed, this time with the P-51 leading the way. In December, the 354th Fighter Group, the first to fly Mustangs in combat, began escorting bombers deep into Germany. Over Bremen, Kiel, and Berlin, the Luftwaffe rose, as always, to meet them. But this time, something was different. The German fighters climbed high, only to find American fighters waiting for them. The P-51s did not turn back when the bombers reached the target. They stayed. They followed. They hunted. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could not attack with impunity. Every approach, every climb, every dive was shadowed by silver shapes in the sun. German pilots who once joked about soft Americans now found themselves outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outflown. One Luftwaffe ace later admitted, "The day the Mustangs appeared, we knew the air war was lost." In the beginning, they had laughed. They had mocked the Americans, dismissed their planes, and underestimated their resolve. But the laughter that had filled the airfields of France and Germany was fading fast. The Mustang had arrived, and soon it would own the sky. The winter skies over Europe had changed. Where once the Luftwaffe's eagles had ruled, now the silver wings of the P-51 Mustang carved their paths across the clouds. The German pilots, once the hunters, were beginning to feel what it meant to be hunted. In early 1944, the Allied air campaign reached its turning point. The United States Army Air Forces had a new weapon, and they intended to use it with precision. The P-51 Mustang was more than just a fighter. It was a guardian. Its long range allowed bombers to strike anywhere in Germany, with protection from takeoff to return. For the Luftwaffe, this changed everything. Their strategy, and built on short, sharp intercepts and quick retreats, began to crumble. Every attack now came with a cost. In the skies above Bremen, Brunswick, and Leipzig, the battles became merciless. Groups of Messerschmitts dove into bomber formations, only to be met by squadrons of Mustangs diving in from the sun. Dogfights stretched for miles, twisting through contrails and smoke. By February 1944, the change was undeniable. The Germans could no longer dictate the terms of battle. The Allied plan was simple and brutal: destroy the Luftwaffe in the air and on the ground. The Mustang made it possible. For the first time, American fighters had the range to follow retreating German planes all the way home, to their very airfields. And they did. Mustang squadrons swept low over Germany, strafing runways, hangars, and fuel depots. They turned the Luftwaffe's once proud bases into smoking wreckage. The impact was devastating. By spring, the Luftwaffe was losing not just aircraft, but pilots, the one thing it could not replace. Before the war, a German pilot trained for years before entering combat. But by 1944, the training program had collapsed under pressure. New pilots were rushed into battle with only a few dozen flight hours. They were sent against seasoned American and British veterans flying Mustangs with superior speed, range, and visibility. It was slaughter. Aces like Adolf Galland, Günter Rahl, and Johannes Steinhoff, men who had once flown with pride and confidence, began to understand that their war was slipping away. They had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and Russia, but now even they admitted the balance of power was gone. Galland later recalled, "We could no longer control the air. Every time we climbed, there they were, Mustangs, always more Mustangs." For the bomber crews, the difference was life itself. Missions that had once ended in disaster now had hope. The tight formations of B-17 and B-24s could look out their windows and see the silver shapes of P-51s flying alongside them, glinting in the sun. It became a symbol, a promise, that they were not alone. In March 1944, during one of the most decisive operations of the air war, the 8th Air Force struck Berlin directly. Hundreds of bombers roared across the continent, escorted the entire way by Mustangs. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, hundreds of fighters rising to meet them. It was their last stand in the skies above their capital. The battle raged for hours. Trails of smoke crossed the horizon like scars. Engines screamed. Explosions flashed through the clouds. But the Germans could not break through. Every attack they launched was met by disciplined swarms of P-51s diving down in counterattack. When the bombers turned for home, the Mustangs turned with them. Still there, still fighting. That day marked the first time American bombers struck Berlin in daylight and returned in strength. The message was clear: Germany's air supremacy was over. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was in ruins. Its fuel supplies were collapsing, its airfields destroyed, its pilots exhausted. Yet still, Hitler demanded more. He ordered his commanders to defend every city, every factory, no matter the cost. It was a demand that only deepened the destruction. The Germans could no longer choose when or where to fight. The Allies, with their P-51 escorts, now owned the air, and with it, the ability to decide the course of the war. Every train, every convoy, every movement of troops was visible to the enemy. The sky had become a weapon, and it was pointed directly at the heart of the Reich. German civilians began to look upward, not with pride but with fear. The sound of engines, once a symbol of power, had become the sound of doom. Still, in the midst of chaos, some Luftwaffe aces continued to fight with remarkable skill. Men like Erich Hartmann, the Blonde Knight, would claim hundreds of victories, but always at greater risk, always against impossible odds. Even for them, the sky was shrinking. The Luftwaffe had once been unstoppable. Now it was trapped beneath the relentless tide of Allied air power. And at the center of that tide was one machine, graceful, deadly, and tireless, the P-51 Mustang. Its arrival had changed the course of the air war. Its presence had broken the myth of German invincibility. But its greatest test, and its greatest triumph, was still to come. Because soon the Mustang would face its most dangerous opponent yet, the jet-powered Me-262, Hitler's last hope for control of the sky. The final chapter of the air war was about to begin. The summer of 1944 brought a new kind of war to the skies over Europe. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, its pilots dying faster than they could be replaced, its airfields burning under relentless attacks. And yet, in secret hangars and underground factories, Germany was building something that it believed would change everything. A weapon so advanced it could rewrite the balance of air power. It was called the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. To German engineers, it was a miracle. To Hitler, it was salvation. And to Allied pilots, it would soon become the most feared silhouette in the sky. The Me-262 could fly at over 540 miles per hour, nearly 150 faster than the best Allied piston engine fighters. Its twin jet engines gave it acceleration no propeller-driven aircraft could match. In a straight line, it was untouchable. When the first reports reached the Allied command, many dismissed them as exaggerated. But the Mustang pilots who encountered it would never forget what they saw. The first appearance of the Me-262 came in mid-1944. Allied bombers over Germany were attacked by sleek, silver aircraft that seemed to come out of nowhere, striking hard, then vanishing into the clouds. Their 30-millimeter cannons tore through bombers like paper. Dozens of aircraft were destroyed in seconds. The Germans believed they had found their answer, but the answer came too late. For all its technological brilliance, the Me-262 faced insurmountable problems. The engines were fragile, burning out after just a few hours of use. Fuel shortages grounded many before they ever took off. Maintenance crews worked in the open under constant Allied bombardment. And then there was Hitler himself. He insisted the jet be used not as a fighter, but as a bomber, a blitz bomber that could strike Allied cities. His interference delayed production and deployment for months, wasting precious time. By the time the Me-262 entered service in significant numbers, the war was already lost. But for the pilots who flew them, the jet represented the last glimmer of pride. Aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nowotny took to the skies, determined to prove that Germany still held mastery of the air. They were brave, skilled, and doomed. The Mustang pilots, realizing they could not match the Me-262 in speed, learned to hunt it differently. They struck during its weakest moments, on takeoff and landing. The jet's engines required long runways and gentle climbs. Its acceleration was sluggish until full power engaged. Allied pilots circled the airfields, waiting for their prey. And when the Me-262s came into land, the Mustangs pounced. It became a deadly routine. Germany's wonder weapon was trapped by the very skies it had been built to dominate. The Luftwaffe was now fighting on borrowed time. Its fuel reserves were nearly gone. Its radar network had collapsed under constant bombing. The P-51s ruled not just the high altitudes, but the airfields, the roads, and the skies from dawn to dusk. The pilots who had once mocked the Mustang now flew in fear of its shadow. By late 1944, the Mustang had become a symbol of inevitability. Everywhere it went, the sky followed. During Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate New Year's Day counterattack, hundreds of German fighters struck Allied airfields in the west. They destroyed planes on the ground, caught squadrons by surprise, and for a few hours it seemed as if the old Luftwaffe spirit had returned. But then, the Mustangs arrived. In minutes, the battle turned. The German attack crumbled under counter-strikes from P-51s and Spitfires. By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had lost over 300 aircraft, most of them destroyed by fighters in the air or by the Allies' superior organization on the ground. It was their last major offensive in the West. After that, the Luftwaffe would never recover. The irony was bitter. The very arrogance that had once fueled German air power had blinded it to reality. While Hitler's generals boasted of invincible technology, American factories had produced more Mustangs, more engines, more pilots. Every hour, a new P-51 rolled off an assembly line somewhere in America. Every hour, another Mustang took to the skies over Europe. The air war was no longer a duel between equals. It had become a contest between endurance and illusion, and illusion was losing. By early 1945, Allied bombers were striking targets deep in Germany with almost no resistance. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged entirely to the Americans. The P-51 Mustang flew over Berlin, over Munich, over every symbol of the Reich. The war had begun with German laughter, confident, mocking, sure of superiority. But now there was only silence. Yet in that silence, one truth endured. The P-51 Mustang had not just defeated an air force, it had redefined air warfare itself, and its story was not yet over. Because beyond the victory in Europe, a new front was already calling. Across the vast Pacific, the war still raged, and soon the Mustang would fly again, this time against a different enemy in a sky half a world away. The war in Europe was ending, but in the Pacific it was far from over. While cities like Berlin and Dresden burned under Allied air raids, across the vast blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean, another brutal conflict raged between the United States and Imperial Japan. The P-51 Mustang had proven its worth over Europe, but its journey was not yet complete. In 1945, it would take on a new role, one that would push it farther, higher, and longer than ever before. As the U.S. prepared for the final stage of the war, the challenge was distance. Japan's cities, factories, and military bases lay scattered across islands, thousands of miles from the nearest Allied airfields. Even the mighty B-29 superfortresses, the most advanced bombers of their time, needed escort fighters to protect them during their long missions over enemy territory. The problem was, no existing fighter had the range to reach Japan and return. No aircraft, that is, except the P-51 Mustang. Fitted with external fuel tanks, the Mustang could now fly over 1,600 miles, long enough to escort bombers from bases on the Mariana Islands all the way to Tokyo and back. It was a feat that had once seemed impossible. For the pilots, these missions were endurance tests of both man and machine. They spent hours over open ocean, flying in formation under scorching sun and sudden storms. Any malfunction meant a watery grave, yet they went, again and again, into the heart of Japan's defenses. The Japanese fighter pilots they faced were not the same as those of the early war. The once elite Air Force of Japan, the men who had flown Zeros over Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea, was now a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages, lack of training, and the relentless pressure of Allied bombing had broken its strength. Still, they fought with the ferocity of desperation. Kamikaze attacks had become the Empire's last resort. Even as their airfields were bombed daily, Japanese pilots took to the skies in aircraft barely held together by parts scavenged from wrecks. And then they met the Mustangs. The P-51s swept across the Pacific like silent predators. Their long-range patrols hunted down enemy planes before they could reach the bombers. Mustang pilots described duels high above Japan's mountains, where the thin air shimmered with sunlight and contrails. They had become what the Germans had once feared most, an enemy that could appear anywhere, strike swiftly, and vanish. But for all its victories, the Mustang's role in the Pacific was more than just combat. It was about endurance, the sheer will to keep flying after years of war. By 1945, many of the Mustang pilots had already fought in Europe. They had seen Stalingrad, Normandy, the Ardennes. Now they found themselves thousands of miles from home once again, flying against an enemy that refused to surrender. In the words of one pilot, "We had won the sky, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like we were just trying to finish what had to be finished." Meanwhile, back in Europe, the skies that had once been filled with Mustangs were now empty. The Luftwaffe was gone. The P-51 squadrons that had fought over Germany began to return home, their aircraft lined up on airfields for one final time. For many pilots, it was a strange, hollow feeling. The war that had defined their lives was ending. The planes that had carried them through it, that had saved them and seen them through every mission, were now being retired, dismantled, or sold for scrap. But the Mustang story did not end in 1945. It was too extraordinary, too iconic, too perfectly designed to fade into history so quickly. After the war, the P-51 became a symbol of victory, of resilience, of what happens when innovation meets necessity. Nations around the world purchased surplus Mustangs for their own air forces. They flew in Israel, South Korea, South America, and Europe, long after the original war had ended. The Mustang was no longer just an American fighter, it was a global legend. But for the men who had flown them first, for the pilots who had taken off from frozen English airfields or Pacific islands of coral and mud, the memories remained vivid. They remembered the laughter of their enemies, the arrogance of those who had once ruled the sky. And they remembered the silence that followed, the silence that came when the P-51 appeared above the clouds, glinting in the sun, and the balance of power shifted forever. For the German aces who survived, the Mustang became a symbol of the turning point, the moment when technology, production, and endurance combined to crush the myth of invincibility. Many would later admit that, after the Mustang arrived, they knew the war was lost. The P-51 had begun as an experiment, a desperate answer to an urgent need. It ended as the defining aircraft of the Second World War. It was more than a machine. It was proof that adaptability and courage could overcome arrogance and experience. And as the world moved into a new age of jet engines and atomic power, one lesson remained, that even the mightiest empires can fall when they underestimate the quiet strength of determination. The laughter of the German pilots had long since vanished. In its place, high above the clouds where the Mustangs had flown, there was only silence and the faint echo of an engine that once changed the course of history. In 1946, across the world, nations were rebuilding, their cities, their industries, and their armies. The jet age had begun. New aircraft like the British Meteor, the American F-80 Shooting Star, and the German Me-262 promised to change everything. But for all their speed and power, none of them carried the legend, the grace, or the legacy of the P-51 Mustang. The war had forged it, but peace would immortalize it. In air bases across Europe, thousands of Mustangs stood silent, lined up in neat rows beneath the open sky. Some were sold for scrap, others were sent to new nations, gifts, trades, or symbols of alliance in the uncertain dawn of the Cold War. Pilots who had once faced death daily now found themselves returning home, leaving behind the aircraft that had carried them through the fire. For many, it was like saying goodbye to a friend. One veteran later recalled, "When I shut down the engine for the last time, the propeller stopped in front of me, just like it always had. I sat there for a minute and realized it was over. The war, the flying, all of it. The Mustang had done its job. But the Mustang's job wasn't quite finished. The world was entering a new kind of conflict. One fought not in open skies, but in the shadows between ideologies. From 1947 onward, the Cold War began to divide the planet. The United States and the Soviet Union built new alliances. An old aircraft like the Mustang suddenly found new life. In Europe, the newly formed air forces of countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and Italy purchased Mustangs from American surplus. In Latin America, nations such as Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic used them to patrol their skies for decades. But the Mustang's most famous post-war battles would take place not in Europe, but in Asia. When war erupted on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, the world was shocked. Once again, American pilots took to the skies, and once again, the P-51 was there. The Mustang's role in Korea was different. It was no longer the dominant fighter it had been in 1944. Jet aircraft, faster, deadlier, now ruled the skies. The Soviet-built MiG-15 was one of the most advanced fighters in the world, and against it, the Mustang was outmatched in speed and altitude. But war is not just about speed, it's about versatility, endurance, and precision. And that was where the P-51 still reigned supreme. In Korea, the Mustang became a ground attack aircraft, strafing enemy columns, hitting supply lines, and supporting United Nations troops under fire. Its long range and ability to operate from rough, makeshift airstrips made it invaluable. Pilots flew low over enemy positions, dodging flak and small arms fire, guiding artillery and striking targets in mountains and valleys. The Mustang was now a veteran among younger machines, but it fought with the same spirit it had carried over Germany and Japan. By then, the aircraft had earned something beyond reputation. It had earned respect. Even among the new generation of jet pilots, many still looked at the Mustang with awe. It was a machine that demanded skill, precision, and nerve. It forgave no mistakes, but for those who understood it, it felt alive. One pilot wrote in his logbook, "The jet may outrun it, but nothing flies like a Mustang. It's the kind of plane that talks back. It breathes with you." By 1953, as the Korean War drew to a close, the P-51's combat career was ending. It had fought through 3 wars, over 2 oceans, and against every major power of its time. And through it all, it had proven something remarkable, that a design born out of desperation in 1940 had become one of the most adaptable, enduring aircraft in history. After Korea, the last operational Mustangs were retired from frontline service, but they never truly disappeared. In air races across America, former military pilots began buying surplus P-51s and restoring them. The skies that had once thundered with the noise of war now echoed with the roar of competition. Reno, Cleveland, and Miami became new battlegrounds. But these were battles of speed, not survival. The Mustang's powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, once designed for war, became a thing of beauty, a symphony of mechanics and mastery. Crowds gathered to watch them race, to feel the sound that once shook Europe and the Pacific. For the men who had flown them in combat, seeing a P-51 fly again was like seeing a ghost from another life, alive, untamed, eternal. They remembered the laughter of their enemies, the arrogance that once filled the skies, and they remembered how it ended, with the Mustang owning the air above them. The war had faded into history, but the lessons remained, that no power, no empire, no legend is beyond challenge, and that sometimes the quiet underdog, the machine built not from pride but from necessity, becomes the one that defines an era. The P-51 Mustang had gone from an unproven prototype to the symbol of air dominance. And though its days of battle were long over, its shadow would stretch across generations. Through every jet that followed, every pilot who learned its name, every sky it once ruled. In the years after the war, the P-51 Mustang became more than a fighter plane. It became a symbol. It represented not only victory in the air, but the triumph of ingenuity, courage, and determination against overwhelming odds. For the pilots who flew it, the Mustang was not just a machine. It was a companion, a guardian, and in many ways an extension of themselves. They often said the Mustang didn't fly you, it flew with you. But history has a way of moving forward. As jet aircraft became faster, sleeker, and more advanced, the world began to leave the piston engine behind. By the late 1950s, the age of propeller-driven fighters was ending. Yet even as technology marched on, the P-51 refused to fade quietly. Across the globe, in nations rebuilding their air forces after the devastation of World War II, Mustangs continued to serve. In Israel, they flew in the War of Independence. In South America, they patrolled borders and supported counterinsurgency operations. In Asia, they protected new nations during turbulent times. Everywhere they went, the sound of that Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, that deep, unmistakable roar, announced both history and defiance. The Mustang was never just an airplane, it was a story that kept finding new chapters. By the early 1960s, the Mustang had largely vanished from military service. Most were scrapped, sold, or displayed in museums. A few, however, survived in private hands, restored, polished, and brought back to life by enthusiasts who refused to let the legend die. These were the warbirds. In air shows across the United States, veterans and civilians alike gathered to watch them soar again. The gleaming silver fuselages, the black and white invasion stripes, the red-nosed markings of the 4th Fighter Group, all brought the past to life in the present. Crowds cheered as the Mustangs performed slow passes and tight rolls, their wings glinting in the sun. For a few moments, the skies of 1944 returned. Not in war, but in remembrance. For many of the old pilots who attended these air shows, it was a kind of homecoming. They were gray now, slower to move, their uniforms long since packed away. But as the P-51 roared overhead, you could see it in their eyes, the spark of youth, the echo of flight. One veteran was once asked what it felt like to see the Mustang again after so many years. He smiled and said, "It's like meeting an old friend who never aged." The P-51 had earned its place not only in history books, but in memory, as the aircraft that changed the war and redefined what flight could be. But its story was not just about mechanics or design. It was about the people who built it, who flew it, and who believed in it when others did not. In 1940, when Britain stood alone against the Axis and America had yet to enter the war, the Mustang was born from a spark of collaboration. North American aviation had promised to design and build an entirely new fighter in just 120 days, and they did. The first prototype flew after only 4 months. It was fast, elegant, and ahead of its time. But early models, powered by Allison engines, struggled at high altitudes. They were good, not great. That all changed when the British suggested fitting the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same one that powered the Spitfire and the Lancaster bomber. The result was extraordinary. The Mustang transformed overnight from a good fighter into a world-class one. The partnership between British engineering and American manufacturing created something neither nation could have achieved alone. And in that cooperation lay a deeper truth, that victory in World War II was not the triumph of one country, but of many working together toward a single purpose. By the time the P-51 reached its peak in 1944, it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, a range unmatched by any other fighter in the war. It was fast enough to take on Germany's best interceptors, agile enough to outturn most of them, and reliable enough to bring its pilots home. For the Luftwaffe, it was a nightmare. Before the Mustang arrived, German fighter pilots had dominated the skies over Europe. They attacked bomber formations almost at will, suffering losses but maintaining control. After the Mustang, that control evaporated. The same officers who had once laughed at the idea of an American fighter challenging their superiority were now watching helplessly as P-51s swept their aircraft from the sky. By late 1944, Luftwaffe aces wrote in their diaries of hopelessness. "We cannot meet them in equal battle anymore," one noted. "They are everywhere." And yet, even in defeat, there was respect. German pilots who survived the war often spoke with admiration, even affection, for the Mustang. They recognized its beauty, its speed, and above all, its precision. It was, in their words, a perfect weapon. The war had taken everything: lives, cities, hope. But it had also produced moments of pure human achievement. The Mustang was one of those moments. After the war, when nations rebuilt and former enemies became allies, something remarkable happened. Former German and American pilots began to meet at reunions, at air shows, at memorials. And when they spoke, they no longer spoke as enemies. They spoke as aviators. They shared stories of dogfights, of fear, of respect. And often the conversation ended the same way, with a quiet smile and the same words repeated across languages. It was a beautiful airplane. Time had turned laughter into memory, arrogance into humility. The sky that once divided men had become the place that united them. The P-51 Mustang had not only conquered the air, it had survived history itself and emerged as something greater than a weapon. It had become a legend. As peace settled over the world, the P-51 Mustang began its second life. The war was over, but the skies were not silent. In Korea, in the deserts of the Middle East, and in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the Mustang flew again, not as a relic, but as a survivor. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, jet aircraft had already entered service. The sleek F-84s and F-84s of the U.S. Air Force represented the future. Fast, agile, and powerful. Yet when the war began, there were too few of them. The Air Force turned to the Mustang once more. In the early months of the conflict, the old propeller-driven fighter became the workhorse of the skies. Renamed the F-51, it provided ground support for UN troops fighting along the Korean peninsula. Pilots who had never known the Second World War now flew the same machines their fathers had. The Mustang proved itself again. Low, fast, and deadly accurate. It could loiter over battlefields for hours, strike with precision, and take damage that would have crippled lighter jets. Soldiers on the ground began to call it their guardian angel. But the world was changing fast. The jet age was relentless. When the MiG-15 arrived over Korea, the old piston fighters could not compete at altitude. The Mustang's days as a frontline combat aircraft were ending. Still, its legend grew. In smaller nations and developing air forces, the P-51 continued to serve for decades. It flew in the air forces of Sweden, the Netherlands, Australia, and the Philippines. It fought in the Middle East, flew border patrols in Central America, and even defended skies in South America into the 1970s. Wherever it appeared, it carried with it the echo of an older war, a memory of when flight had depended on courage as much as technology. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the Mustang was not in combat, but in what it represented. It symbolized the turning point of a generation, the moment when the Allies proved that innovation could overcome experience and that determination could surpass arrogance. When the Mustang first appeared in 1942, few believed it could challenge the Luftwaffe's dominance. The German pilots laughed at it, a newcomer, a product of an industry they considered inferior. But the Mustang's rise was proof that underestimating an opponent is the first step toward defeat. By 1944, it was not the Germans who hunted over Europe. It was the Americans. The skies that had once belonged to the Reich now belonged to the Mustang. And in that transformation was a lesson that extended far beyond the battlefield. The story of the P-51 was also the story of collaboration. Its success came from the fusion of British innovation and American production, of shared engineering and shared sacrifice. It was born in a time when nations united not for conquest, but for survival. And that unity, fragile, determined, and imperfect, changed the course of history. Decades later, when aviation historians look back, they called the Mustang the finest piston engine fighter ever built. Its balance of speed, range, and agility had set a standard that would never again be matched in that era. But to the men who flew it, those technical details mattered less than what it felt like. They remembered the sound, the deep, confident growl of the Merlin engine, They remembered the sensation, the smooth roll, the effortless climb, the feeling that the aircraft itself wanted to fly higher. And they remembered the sight, the long silver nose, the black propeller slicing through the dawn sky. For many, the Mustang represented freedom itself, the freedom to fly, to fight, to survive. In museums today, the P-51 rests behind ropes and glass, silent and pristine. But when you stand close enough, you can still sense what it once was. Not a relic, but a living thing. The rivets, the scratches, the smell of oil and metal, all whisper the story of men who once trusted their lives to this machine. In hangars across America and Europe, a few of these aircraft still take to the air. They are lovingly restored by private owners, engineers, and veterans' families who see themselves as caretakers of history. Each flight is both a performance and a tribute, a salute to those who never came home. Every year at airfields from Oshkosh to Duxford, the Mustang flies again. Crowds look up. Children cover their ears against the thunder of its engine. Veterans stand in silence, their eyes fixed on the sky. And for a few brief moments, time disappears. The world becomes 1944 again. The roar of the Merlin fills the air, and the legend lives. For the German pilots who once ruled the sky, the Mustang became both nemesis and teacher. It taught them that pride has limits, that technology without humility leads to downfall. And for the Allied pilots who flew it, it taught another lesson, that courage and innovation, joined together, can achieve the impossible. When the war ended, the laughter of 1940 faded into the silence of 1945. But the sound that replaced it, the steady hum of the Mustang's engine, the rhythm of freedom in flight, would echo across generations. It was more than the end of a war. It was the beginning of an era, one built not on domination, but on understanding what it had cost to win the sky. By the late 1940s, the P-51 Mustang had already entered the realm of legend. It was no longer just an aircraft. It was a symbol. To those who had lived through the war, it represented victory, endurance, and the relentless pursuit of progress. To younger generations, it was the sound of history itself, captured in the growl of the Merlin engine. But legends are not born in factories. They are born in struggle and sustained by memory. As the world rebuilt, the Mustang became a reminder of what had been achieved through unity and sacrifice. Across airfields now filled with peace instead of war, the silhouette of the Mustang stood for something deeply human, the triumph of determination over despair. In the United States, surplus P-51s were sold off by the hundreds. They were bought by private pilots, small air forces, and even movie studios. Some were turned into racing planes, stripped down and painted in bright colors, built for speed instead of war. In Reno, Nevada, a new tradition began: the National Championship Air Races. Former warbirds like the Mustang roared around pylons at nearly 500 miles per hour, competing not for survival, but for glory. The same machine that once fought in the skies over Europe now danced above crowds of cheering civilians. Yet even as it thrilled spectators, the Mustang remained something sacred. For veterans, it was not a toy, but a memory of friends who had never returned. Every flight was an echo of the past, a conversation between the living and the lost. One pilot wrote years later, "When I hear that engine start, I don't just hear power. I hear the voices of my squadron. I see the trails over Berlin. I remember what it cost to earn the sky." The P-51 story was far from over. Around the world, it continued to serve in quiet corners of post-war history. In Latin America, Mustangs flew patrols into the 1960s. In Israel, they flew in the nation's first air battles of 1948, outmatching their opponents with speed and precision. In Sweden and Switzerland, they guarded neutrality from the edge of the Cold War. Wherever it flew, it carried the same message. Innovation and adaptability were timeless weapons. Technically, the Mustang had been surpassed. The jet age was here. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, the Comet, and the Meteor, all faster, all newer, all symbols of a different kind of war. But in one crucial way, the Mustang remained unmatched. It had soul. The Mustang was a pilot's aircraft, alive, responsive, and personal. The stick moved as if wired to the heart, The wings responded like muscle. It forgave mistakes, rewarded precision, and demanded respect. It was not the most advanced aircraft ever built, but it was, in the words of one aviator, the most human. To understand why, one must return to its design. The Mustang's genius lay not just in its speed or range, but in its balance. Its laminar flow wing, revolutionary for its time, reduced drag and improved efficiency. Its airframe combined strength with grace. Its bubble canopy gave pilots visibility unmatched in the war. And the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the heart of the machine, transformed it from capable to extraordinary. Each part alone was impressive. Together, they became perfection in motion. To the German pilots who once laughed at it, the Mustang's name became a memory of loss. The Me-10-9s and FW-190, as they once flew with pride, were now museum pieces, like the Reich they had served. But to the Allied pilots, the Mustang remained a living legacy. It was the proof that freedom, when armed with knowledge and courage, could master even the darkest skies. In the decades after the war, as veterans aged and the memory of combat faded, the Mustang became a bridge between generations. It appeared in films and documentaries, its silhouette etched into the imagination of millions. It became the aircraft of remembrance, a reminder of sacrifice, innovation, and endurance. And for those who had never seen it in war, the sound of its engine still carried something profound. Not fear, but reverence. The Germans once believed that no American aircraft could match their technology, no Allied pilot could match their skill, and no nation could challenge their dominance in the air. The Mustang proved them wrong, not just by shooting them down, but by embodying everything they had underestimated: creativity, adaptability, and faith in something larger than conquest. It wasn't just a machine of war, it was a machine of belief. Today, when a P-51 takes to the air, it carries more than its own weight. It carries the weight of memory, of men who faced impossible odds and refused to yield, of engineers who built under pressure, and of nations that learned unity through necessity. Each time it climbs toward the sun, the Mustang reminds us that even in war, there are moments of grace, moments when courage and creation intersect, when the human spirit proves it can still rise above destruction. The Mustang ruled the skies for only a few short years, but its shadow stretches across a century. It began as a promise, rose as a weapon, and endures as a legend. And long after the last pilot has flown, the world will still remember the plane that made the impossible possible, the aircraft that turned laughter into awe. By the dawn of the jet age, the P-51 Mustang had already transcended its role as a weapon. It had become a symbol, not just of war, but of transformation. It stood as a bridge between eras, from the piston-driven thunder of the Second World War to the silent supersonic reach of the Cold War to come. In the years following 1945, many believed that the Mustang's time had ended. The jet was the future. The F-80 Shooting Star, the F-86 Sabre, and the British Meteor promised speeds and heights once unthinkable. The old propeller fighters were sold off, scrapped, or sent to distant air forces where the next battles, smaller and more obscure, would be fought. But the P-51 had one more chapter to write. In 1950, the world was once again at war, this time on the Korean Peninsula. The conflict began suddenly, brutally, and in the chaos of the first months, old lessons had to be relearned fast. The jet fighters that symbolized progress, the F-80s and F-84s, were fast, but they were short-ranged and struggled to provide close air support for troops on the ground. The United States needed a fighter that could loiter, strike, and endure. And from the warehouses and training fields of post-war America, the old Mustangs returned to service. The P-51 was reborn as the F-51 Mustang. Once again, the Mustang found itself flying over a landscape of extremes: frozen mountains, humid valleys, and the smoke of endless battle. It strafed enemy supply lines, escorted bombers, and provided cover for soldiers fighting in trenches below. It was no longer the glamorous dogfighter of 1944. The jet age belonged to others now. But in Korea, the Mustang proved that technology alone does not define greatness. Its endurance, range, and precision made it invaluable. Pilots once again trusted the machine, and it did not let them down. Many who flew it in Korea were too young to remember the skies over Europe. To them, the P-51 was already a legend, something from their father's war. But when they took the stick and felt the engine come alive, the legend became real. One young pilot later wrote, "When I opened the throttle and heard the Merlin roar, I understood why they called it the best fighter ever built. It didn't just respond, it spoke back." The Mustang's service in Korea was its final campaign as a frontline aircraft. By 1953, jets had fully taken over. But the legacy of the Mustang was now immortal, not in blueprints or airframes, but in what it had represented. In an age defined by machines, it had revealed something deeply human, that victory is born from adaptation, creativity, and spirit. In the decades that followed, nations across the world still flew the Mustang. From Central and South America to the Middle East and Asia, it served under countless flags. Colombia, El Salvador, Indonesia, Guatemala, South Africa, and others. Some flew them into the 1970s. Each nation left its mark on the aircraft, painting new insignias over faded stars and stripes. But beneath the colors, the soul remained unchanged. The same sleek wings, the same engine note that once haunted the Luftwaffe's radios. Meanwhile, in the skies of peace, the Mustang found a second life. Restored warbirds took flight at air shows, their silver fuselages gleaming in the sun. Crowds gathered not to see destruction, but remembrance, the living sound of history. When a Mustang's Merlin engine starts, there's a moment, just before the propeller blurs into motion, when time itself seems to hold its breath. Veterans close their eyes, children look up, and for an instant, the distance between past and present disappears. To many who once fought beneath its shadow, the P-51 became more than metal. It was memory given wings, a symbol of courage forged in the most desperate days of the 20th century. For the German pilots who once underestimated it, the Mustang became the ghost of defeat. They remembered its silhouette flashing through cloud, the glint of sunlight off its wings, the distant scream of the Merlin as it dived. They had called it the long-range menace. After the war, some admitted, it was the machine that ended their air superiority for good. Yet there was also respect, the quiet, professional respect of one pilot for another. Many Luftwaffe veterans, decades later, spoke of the Mustang with a kind of admiration that transcended rivalry. It was fast, one said, but more than that, it had a will. And perhaps that was what defined it most. The Mustang was not born from arrogance or ideology. It was born from necessity, designed by men who worked under pressure, guided by instinct, driven by the simple belief that something better could always be built. It was proof that greatness can emerge not from perfection, but from perseverance. By the 1960s, as space rockets rose and jet engines screamed, the Mustang might have seemed a relic, a link to a vanished world. But in every generation since, it has returned to the sky, in restored form or memory, carrying its message forward. That courage and ingenuity will always find a way to rise. The German pilots had laughed once, confident in their superiority, certain their machines would rule the air forever. But history had a different plan. The P-51 Mustang, born in crisis, forged in war, and remembered in peace, had done more than win battles. It had changed the very shape of the sky. By the time the Second World War ended, the P-51 Mustang had already written itself into history. But its true story, its meaning, lived far beyond the war itself. It became a mirror of an age, a testament to human determination, and a reminder of how arrogance can fall before innovation. The German pilots who once laughed at it could never have imagined how quickly the balance of power in the air would shift. For years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies of Europe. Sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving out of the sun, confident that nothing could challenge their speed or skill. And yet, by 1944, the hunters had become the hunted. The P-51 Mustang, fast, agile, and untiring, ruled the air. It began as an experiment, born from urgency, a design requested by the British, improved by the Americans, and perfected by the combination of British engines and American innovation. When the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine met the Mustang's frame, something extraordinary happened. A machine that could outrun and outfight the best the Luftwaffe had ever built. For the German pilots, the war in the air had always been about control, about deciding who lived, who died, and who ruled the sky. But the arrival of the Mustang changed that forever. At first, they underestimated it. They mocked its long-range design, its civilian comfort, its odd shape. A plane for amateur, some said. But when the P-51 appeared high over Germany, escorting bombers deep into the Reich, staying with them from takeoff to return, the laughter ended. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could no longer control the airspace above its own homeland. The German fighters that once rose to tear through Allied bomber formations found themselves met head-on by swarms of Mustangs. Faster, higher, more maneuverable. The result was devastating. In 1944 alone, more than half of Germany's remaining fighter strength was destroyed. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, became a shadow of itself. German aces, men like Gallen, Hartmann, and Rahl, fought bravely, but they knew the truth. The war was over the moment the Americans could reach Berlin with bombers protected by Mustangs from start to finish. The P-51 did not win the war alone, but it changed its rhythm. It made daylight bombing possible again. It gave courage to those flying heavy bombers through deadly skies. It took away the last advantage the German Air Force had. And in doing so, it broke the myth of Luftwaffe invincibility. One German pilot later said, "When the Mustangs came, we knew the end was near. They were everywhere, above us, behind us, waiting for us to climb." But the story of the P-51 was never just about speed, range, or numbers. It was about evolution, about what happens when necessity forces imagination to its limits. Every inch of its design spoke to that. The laminar flow wing that sliced through the air, the bubble canopy that gave pilots unmatched visibility, the long-range fuel tanks that let it fly where no fighter had gone before. Each element was born not from perfection, but from pressure. And in that pressure, brilliance emerged. After the war, as peace returned, the skies changed. Jet engines replaced propellers, radar replaced instinct, and the dogfights that once defined a generation faded into memory. But the Mustang endured. It flew in Korea, in Israel, in Central America. It became a part of countless nations' histories, and wherever it flew, it carried a lesson written in metal and memory, that innovation, when paired with courage, can change the course of history. In time, it became something more than a weapon. It became a work of art. The sound of the Merlin engine, a living relic. The polished silver fuselage, a reflection of an age when the world hung in balance, and courage was measured in altitude and fuel. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was not just a plane. It was a companion. Many spoke of it as if it were alive, as if it shared their heartbeat. It forgave mistakes. It protected. It carried them home when everything else failed. And for those who never returned, it became their last monument. The sound of its engine, the echo of their courage across time. In the end, the P-51 Mustang represented something far greater than air superiority. It represented the triumph of humility over arrogance, of learning over presumption. The German pilots had laughed at it once, at its origins, its purpose, even its pilots. But when the sky belonged to the Mustang, that laughter vanished. What remained was respect, and the undeniable truth that the measure of a machine lies not in where it begins, but in what it becomes. From the fields of England to the skies above Berlin, from the Arctic winds of Norway to the heat of Italy, the Mustang flew as a promise that freedom, once airborne, cannot easily be silenced. It owned the sky, it changed the war, and it proved once and for all that sometimes the ones who are laughed at in the beginning are the ones history remembers forever. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.